we have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order.
This is Multipolarity, charting the rise of the new multipolar world order. Coming up this week, Kamala Harris is ahead in 6 key swing states, according to several major polls, all of which are categorically wrong. Could the ghost of the shy Trumper be about to smite the Dems for the 3rd election running? And why are the usual media suspects pretending it isn't a thing, never has been, and never could be? Meanwhile, in Malaysia and Indonesia, a new domino theory is starting to stack up. In a world of friendshoring and Belt and Road, the Pacific Rim was always going to be the key prize, and China is gaining the upper hand. Finally, Twitter X is being pitched into a classic royale between the mobile forces of capital and the fixed forces of national politics. Not content with fighting a flame war against Keir Starmer, Elon Musk is now being set upon by Thierry Breton, Europe's information commissar, which is like being savaged by not one dead sheep, but 2. In the most mobile industry in the world, 30 years of globalisation theory suggests there can only be one winner. One look at Musk's meme game says he could still flub it. But first, once shy, twice bitten. The US presidential campaign is upon us, and for the past few years, every time the US electoral campaign comes up, I get to go crazy for a few weeks because I read in newspapers, one newspaper after another, how well the Democratic Party candidate is doing. It's constantly portrayed that they're polling really well and that they're going to win the election. And there's plenty of professional pollsters out there, famous ones like Nate Silver at 538, that could go out and correct these obvious errors of interpretation, but they don't, and we don't know why they don't do that. It must be just some sort of forgetting. Maybe they eat too much chili at lunch and they get a bit sleepy or something. Not clear, but they don't come out and correct these egregious errors that are peddled in the media constantly. So what do I mean? Well, look, The Hill released its latest moving averages, which is the correct way to do polls, not spotty little single polls that show one candidate ahead. Beware of them. Moving averages. The Hill has released its latest moving averages in battleground states. And of course, The Hill, being a kind of DC insider publication and Democratic leaning, is championing the fact that Harris is ahead in most of the battleground states. Lo and behold, it is true. Harris is ahead in all but 2 of the battleground states. Trump is ahead in Nevada, Georgia, and Arizona. And Harris is ahead in Pennsylvania, Michigan, Virginia, and Wisconsin. So, shake it out. It looks like Harris is ahead in more battleground states than Trump. Lies, lies, lies. Okay, that is completely and utterly misleading. And the reason for that is something that all the pollsters know about. But again, they get sleepy after lunch and they forget to correct people on this. It's known as the shy Trump effect in polling. It's the most obvious thing in the world if you look at the data from the 2016 election and the 2020. Trump does much better in the actual election than he polls. And it's not just a little better. It's not like he gets 1% or 2% more than the polls say. That's margin of error. That's normal margin of error when it comes to polls and exit polls / results. No, Trump tends to get like 5% more, like 6% more sometimes. It's a completely reliable phenomenon. You see it in state after state, and it always holds. Now, why is the shy Trump effect there? There are many theories. Well, actually, there aren't that many theories, but the best one is basically this. There are a bunch of men, middle-aged men or younger, and they all share something in common. They're married and they vote for Trump. But they don't say they vote for Trump. So why don't they say they vote for Trump? Because their wife will kill them. That's basically what the shy Trump effect almost definitely is. And it's a big enough percentage of the vote. As I said, it can swing from the polls to the exit polls. It can swing like 2, 3, 4, 5, 6%. So it's a sizable amount of men. I mean, maybe not all of them are men, but this is probably what the shy Trump voter is. Who deny on the phone that they're going to vote for Trump. So how far ahead is Harris in these polls that everybody's touting? Well, I'll tell you. Pennsylvania, 0.8%. Okay, Harris is behind about 3 or 4 points there, maybe 5. 1.8% in Michigan, probably behind about 3, something like that. Ahead in Virginia by 2.6%. Yeah, behind by about 3 or 4. And Wisconsin, that's her best poll in the battleground states, plus 3.2. She's probably behind by 1 point. So I'll just give one more example, just concrete example here of what I mean by this. So in Nevada and Arizona, 2 of the states that Trump is currently leading, in 2020, Biden was ahead by 6.5% in Nevada and 3.4% in Arizona. Biden won Nevada by only 2.3%. So it went down from 6.5% in the polls to 2.3% in the actual result. 4 points in the difference. In Arizona, where Biden was supposed to be ahead in the polls 3.4%, he only won by 0.3%. He barely won. So the poll was lying by about 3%. And Arizona turned out to be one of those states that a lot of the Trump people thought was stolen for various reasons. But one of the reasons basically is because the margin was so tight. So this is the point. This shy Trump effect is incredibly well known among pollsters. And yet they're not talking about it. And it's really, really, really irritating to me. Now, of course, we know why it is. Because the pollsters, or most of the ones that have a name for themselves or something, are tied to the Democratic Party or their Democratic Party voters, one or the other. But it is very annoying that you can't actually just go to people and say, look, these polls, Harris is polling really badly. She's way behind Joe Biden and she's way behind Hillary Clinton in 2016. Joe Biden barely won and Hillary Clinton lost. Ergo, according to the polls, Kamala Harris is going to lose the election. And the only way, unless the polls change drastically between now and November, and I don't think they will, they might even get worse for Harris, but the only way she could possibly win the election is if the shy Trump effect has disappeared. And if somebody wants to make that case, they can, but no one's made the case. I don't even know how they'd make the case. But if they wanted to make the case that Harris is actually seriously polling well, they have to make that case. Well, I ask our listeners, look around at the media. Do you see anyone talking about the shy Trump effect? Probably not. Do you see anyone making a case that it's disappeared and that's why Harris is going to get over the line? No. All you see is cherry-picked polls, stuff about Harris catching up, etc., etc. And frankly, at a certain point, they're just lying to people because the information is out there and they could talk to their pollster friends over a drink and figure this out, but they don't. So I guess I'm going to be driven crazy between now and November, constantly pointing out the shy Trump effect and constantly being ignored until Harris loses the election and everyone goes, but we thought she was polling so well. It's a rerun of 2016.
Yeah. Philip, I don't know really how US polling companies work, but I know in the UK, for example, that when there's a phenomenon like the one which you're talking about, the shy Trump effect, and it affects the accuracy of polls compared with the compared with the final election results. For the next election, the pollsters take advantage of that. After each election, they usually do a series of kind of internal research to see what they got wrong, what they got right, why it was. Because these opinion polls, it's not like they're calling every single citizen in Wisconsin or every single citizen in Pennsylvania. What they're doing is they're taking a weighted sample. And usually the sample's not that big at all. It's a few thousand or low tens of thousands. But their argument is because of their weighting system, because of the way that they select the people they speak to and who they voted for last time and what demographics they are and what socioeconomic position they are, you get this kind of weighted result. And the argument is you only need one spoonful of soup to know that the whole bowl is too salty, so to speak. So you only need this weighted sample to be able to provide an accurate answer. And then after the election, they go look at their poll, their final polls, they compare that to the actual election results, and they see where they've got things wrong, and they readjust things. I mean, my assumption, Philip, would be that if the shy Trump effect was such a big deal in 2016, the pollsters would have taken that into account in their weightings, in their models, and the results that they were producing now take that into account, right? Like they are including that shy Trump effect. Have you heard anything whatsoever to suggest that that's what they've done, or is there a general assumption that that's what they've done? Because if it is, with the greatest respect, your assumptions that there's going to be a kind of a 4 to 6% boost for Trump on election day compared with the polling numbers is going to be quite a way off, and Harris is indeed a big favorite, right?
Well, what we can say for sure is that they did not adjust for the shy Trump effect in 2020 because it still existed. So we knew that the shy Trump effect existed in 2016. It actually shocked everybody. Everyone went, why did the polls perform so badly? Hillary Clinton was ahead. Anyone remember 538? Like 95% chance Hillary Clinton's going to win the election. Yeah, I remember that one. So like they knew this was the biggest shock event for pollsters in recent American electoral history. And then along comes 2020 showing Joe Biden's like 8% ahead or whatever in Wisconsin, and he wins by like 2. Shy Trump effect's still there. So we know for a fact they did not adjust for the shy Trump effect when it first appeared. Now, why is that? Because I don't think there is any way to adjust for it. Here's the thing. Pollsters are very good at throwing up a lot of dust around what they actually do. The funny thing about pollsters is most of them aren't super stats guys. They're just not really like that. They're more like political operatives. Now, sometimes pollsters consult statisticians. Sometimes they use statistical techniques. Sometimes it's kind of interesting. But at the end of the day, they always say polling's more of an art than a science. And I really think that's true because a lot of the pollsters aren't very, they're not very technocratic-y minded. They're not very mathsy. They're kind of like political guys. And when you see someone like Nate Silver come along, who's like written a book on the signal and the noise, and he's into stats and all that, that's actually unusual. And actually what Nate Silver's good on stats. I think his book, The Signal and the Noise, was actually quite good as a popular introduction to many of those concepts. So I'm not kind of slagging him off. But what he really does, he's not applying some big stats brain to polls. What he's doing is he's giving an illusion that polls are more scientific than they are by being a more scientific oriented person. Polls are mainly an art, and they're mainly the art of asking people good questions, calling people up and asking them about things and getting good at that. And if you're good at that, that's an art that no science could ever trump. And that's what makes figures like Nate Silver quite funny, because I don't think Nate Silver's run many polls in his life. I don't think he really knows that much about polling. He knows a lot about statistics and so on, but he doesn't know that much about polling, would be my guess. So how do you really correct for the shy Trump effect as a pollster? Look, you only have one of two choices, at least on its face. You can either ask everyone who they're going to vote for, and then when you get those numbers back, you apply an arbitrary adjustment to them, in which case you're not actually reporting a poll. As a pollster, you're not reporting a poll. You're reporting the results of your poll and then applying an arbitrary adjustment to it. The only other possibility to correct for the shy Trump effect is to come up with a clever way of asking people questions to catch them out. One pollster, as far as I know, has done that. He's a guy called Robert Cahaly. And what Robert Cahaly has done, I can't remember the name of his firm, but he's on Twitter, Robert Cahaly. You can go and look him up, Cahaly. What he did in the 2020 election after realizing about the shy Trump effect is he'd ask an additional question to voters. He'd say, who are you going to vote for? And they'd say Trump or they'd say Biden. And then he'd say, and who do you think most of your friends in your category, like middle-aged man, are going to vote for? And what he found was most people said their candidate. So they said, I'll vote for Biden. I'm a middle-aged woman. I'll vote for Biden. What are most middle-aged women voters going to vote for? They say Biden as well. But in this group that I think are the shy Trump voters, and Cahaly does too, they'd say they're voting for Biden, but then when asked who they thought their friends, middle-aged men, were going to vote for, they'd say Trump. And if he used that answer rather than the initial answer, he found that his polls were much more accurate. And he has a very good record state by state in doing this. But it's not perfect. And what you're doing is slightly misleading. So there's not really a way to adjust these things. Now, here's the final thing I'd say. The DNC, the Democratic National Committee, are very good at winning elections, and they're full of very talented political people, organizers, get out the vote people, people thinking about campaign strategy and stuff. They're probably some of the best in the world. They know about the shy Trump effect, okay? When they get these polls in, they are probably doing the arbitrary adjustment that I'm doing on Twitter. They're probably doing the same thing, unless they're completely incompetent. And that actually leads me to believe that the reason that they selected a fairly left-wing a vice presidential candidate, and a vice presidential candidate that's quite outspoken on the Gaza issue, is I think they know they're going to lose the election. And I think what they're doing is they're trying to get the House. There's a chance that they can get the House, but in order to get the House, they need relatively high turnout among their base. And I think that's what they're pitching for. Now, I may be wrong, and they may be about to be fooled by the shy Trump effect for the third time. But I don't think cynical, hardened political operatives in the DNC are fooled by that stuff. I think only the punters are fooled by that stuff.
Well, just to add a little bit of balance here, it's been known for a while that prediction markets can offer a more accurate forecast of election results than political polling. There was a paper in the Cambridge University Press that suggested as much a couple of years ago. Now, in the prediction market, Kamala Harris is a fairly decent favorite at this time. The sorpasso from Trump to Harris took place on July 31st or July 30th, August 1st. And July 31st, August 1st. And she has been the favorite since then. In fact, extending her lead a little bit. So, I mean, the prediction markets are usually better than the opinion polls, and they have Harris ahead as well. One thing I would add, Philip, is, as listeners know, I know very little about American politics. So perhaps I can say this as somebody, 60,000 feet above the fray and knowing very little about the minutiae and having absolutely no preference one way or the other, no tribal loyalty here. One thing I would say is this. America seems to me to be an incredibly polarized nation, if at all possible, even more polarized than Britain, I would say. And in such an environment, my instinct is that any election that offers essentially a two-way option, which the US presidential election does, third-party candidates have meant absolutely nothing since Ross Perot. So it's a two-way choice, and in a polarized political environment driven by so much tribalism, my guess is that the result will be extremely close. It'll be knife edge either way, whoever wins. That's my view. There's going to be no big win for either side.
Two very brief points on that before we move on. First of all, betting markets have missed the shy Trump effect. I've never really seen, especially in a system like America, why a betting market should work. You have to understand the dynamics of the battleground states. Most people don't understand those dynamics, so I just think they're making random calls. It's a very good vibes indicator, so it was a very good thing for when Biden's approval collapsed. We could see that it collapsed very quickly in the betting markets, and we had to wait a couple of days for the polls to come in and show the same thing. It's good for that. It's good for directional turns, not so good for producing the end structural result, and it shouldn't be if you actually think what it is. The second point I make is you might be right. It might end up being a close result. But look, I'm a quant guy. That's what I've done for most of my life. And I'm just saying, going on the pure quantitative data we have in front of us, Harris is going to lose bad. She looks like the worst candidate since George McGovern. Now, people may turn around to me and say, you don't get it. The vibes have shifted, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know what to make of that. I'm a quant-based guy. I can't say much more. When I hear about the vibes, I'm just like, somebody in the media is saying something and it's influencing what everybody thinks. Harris is the worst candidate they've run for a very long time, maybe since McGovern. And she could lose quite badly. Not as bad as McGovern, but quite badly.
Domino theory revisited.
Last week, the Wall Street Journal ran a really interesting article. The title was "In One Nation, anger over US's Gaza policy opens door wider for China. And what this was about was Malaysia's prime minister criticizing the US for the position on China. But it went much deeper than that. It's a great article. And basically, it laid out how the Malaysian prime minister, Anwar Ibrahim, when he came to power, he was very promising for the United States. The State Department was very in favor of him coming to power. He was known as kind of a quote-unquote supporter of democracy, and he understood Washington quite well because he'd worked there as an academic in the 2000s. So he was seen as kind of quasi-Americanized and so on. Well, things are going very differently right now. The country is incredibly angry over the Gaza war. The article goes into how American consumer brands such as Starbucks and McDonald's are battling boycotts and having their outlets vandalized. I mean, the Malaysian population are really animated by the war in the Middle East. At the same time, just to give some numbers on that, so in a poll of 8,000 people in 16 Arab nations this year, 76% said that their view of the US has become more negative since the Gaza war. The Wall Street Journal states that that effect is taking place in Malaysia as well. So these countries like Malaysia, which, you know, a lot of Muslim countries don't view the America very well due to foreign policy issues, countries in the Middle East, but the Muslim countries in the Far East, often they have very good connections to America for historical reasons and so on. But now they're becoming completely alienated from them. So basically, Anwar, the president, is starting to say very good things about the Chinese. So I'll just give you a direct quote. He rejected what he called, quote unquote, incessant propaganda that Malaysians should fear China's economic and military might. He said, quote, "I sense the attitude of the Chinese leadership, friendly, courteous, full of respect, understanding of cultures and differences. This is not what is being portrayed elsewhere," end quote. So he's coming out really as kind of a pro-China president. Now, Andrew, I know you have some thoughts on what that means. It's very, very important. But in addition to that, Anwar went on Chinese television and said that Malaysia is intending on joining the BRICS. So this isn't just some abstract, you know, let's put out a bit of rhetoric to see if we can stir up the Americans, maybe put some pressure on them over the Gaza war, maybe be able to get a few goodies out of it ourselves if we can kind of figure out an angle. No. He's following up this rhetoric with a concrete step of joining the BRICS. I mean, I think we've talked about the impact of the Gaza war on perceptions abroad of America before. This one, it seems to me, particularly important. The very last point I'd make from the Wall Street Journal article is that Malaysia has also become very important as part of the, future supply chain of semiconductors. So as America have been pulling investment out of China, now we've talked about it on the show before, I don't think it matters that much, but as they've been doing that, they've been pumping it into other countries, famously Vietnam, but another one of them is Malaysia, and they've been focusing on semiconductor production. Well, that's going to be a giant waste of time if Malaysia gets tied into the BRICS nexus and becomes very pro-Chinese in its outlook in the region. One more thing. Sorry, I knew I said I'd leave it there, but there was one more point in the article that's worth raising. Malaysia have made very clear their stance on the Taiwan issue, and they've taken the Chinese side almost completely. Interestingly, what Anwar said, at least what was reported in the Wall Street Journal, is that he said, we don't want outside powers meddling in the region. And that was in response both to the Taiwan issue and some of the tensions that have been there in the region between China and Malaysia itself. So, you know, to portray the American interests in that region as being a kind of an outsider alien force, well, first of all, that's exactly the Chinese position. But second of all, you know, if you say that to your people, you can't really unsay it because everyone then starts seeing it that way. So these are very, very dramatic changes, I'd say, that are taking place in Malaysia. It's a very important country. And as the Wall Street Journal article shows, Americans are taking it seriously, but I don't think they know what to do about it.
Well, it seems to a certain degree, at least on the popular level rather than the governmental level, it's going to be very difficult for them to turn around right away, given their involvement in the conflict in Gaza and their extremely close alliance with Israel. It seems that there are protests and boycotts against American companies that operate in Malaysia at the moment. And this is providing a base for any politician who would wish to move a little bit closer to China and a little bit farther away from the US. That's inevitably going to be popular in a majority Muslim country like Malaysia. The more concerning thing, I would say, for the US is something very similar is happening in Indonesia as well. So a little bit of background. Indonesia is one of the world's most important nickel producer. It's responsible for 37% of total mined nickel production. Now, nickel is of paramount importance in a whole range of industrial uses, but crucially, it is absolutely necessary for the green revolution, the green industrial revolution that is so beloved of the European Union and also left of center politicians in the United States. You need nickel as a prime component of lithium-ion batteries. So any electric vehicle, any grid storage of electricity, all of the gadgets that we love in our houses, like smartphones and laptops and all that sort of thing, rely on nickel. But they're also used for things like the blades on hydroelectric turbines and the blades on wind electricity generating windmills. So nickel's really important. And in 2000, the Indonesian government, which has always been wary of falling into the resource curse, which I'm sure our listeners will be well aware of, decided that what it was going to do was ban the export of raw nickel ore in an attempt to force companies and force multinationals who were mining it to build smelters in Indonesia. And the idea was this, that they would be able to move up the value chain, so they wouldn't just be exporting the raw oil that had been dug out the ground. They would be actually making something with it as well. So they would be capturing more of the value addition of their huge nickel resources in the country. But that would also create jobs, it would raise tax revenue, and it would boost economic development as well. And actually, contrary to what the Washington consensus would tell us about the economics, it seems to have worked really well. If you look at the data in 2019, Indonesia's nickel value add-on was about $1.1 billion. But in 2021, it had increased to $20.8 billion. And in the 5 years to 2021, the compound average annual growth rate of nickel production was 30%. So you can see that Indonesia is an increasingly vital node, an increasingly vital source of one of the most important natural resources for the 21st century, if those who believe in the Green Revolution are going to be true. Unfortunately, the European Union wasn't happy with this, and it took Indonesia to the WTO about that. And the IMF has been adding pressure as well. And as that was happening, obviously, Indonesia was looking to balance this with better relations with China. And China, of course, itself is very, very invested in things like electric vehicles and battery production. So it saw an opportunity to invest in Indonesia and invest in some of these smelting plants. And indeed, they have some big projects that are looking to come online over the next few years. So this has gradually moved Indonesia slightly away from the US and Western camp more broadly and into China's camp. And Indonesia is now looking to do the same with bauxite. Now, bauxite sounds like the sort of thing you've never heard of, but it's the mineral, it's the ore from which aluminium is smelted. You can get it from other minerals as well, but bauxite is mainly the one that they use to smelt aluminium from. And Indonesia there controls 6%. So Indonesia has been drifting away from the West over the last few years based on this policy and based on Chinese investment. But people will have noticed Indonesia is also a Muslim country. And like Malaysia, they've also had protests against US companies like McDonald's and Starbucks, which operate in Indonesia. I would say that this is something that is affecting the whole of the ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, in quite similar ways. It seems very clear that China is making some gains with them and the US is making some losses. And US geopolitics in the Middle East, and specifically its alliance with Israel, isn't helping. I would say that the recent polling done of the people in the ASEAN nations showed that for the first time, when asked if you were forced to align yourselves with either the US or China, which would you choose? For the very first time overall in ASEAN, China overtook the US. Now that's particularly noticeable in Indonesia and Malaysia. They are the most pro-China versus the US nations in ASEAN. China preference is approaching 80% in those countries, so 4 out of 5. That's increased from 54% just last year, right? So this is a big shift. And I would say that geopolitically as well, this is actually important. It's not just about resources. It's not just about semiconductors. It's not just about having feel-good alliances with cool up-and-coming Asian countries. It's something more than that. I urge listeners to look at a map of Southeast Asia. Imagine for a moment that China and Taiwan come to a head on their disagreements with regard to independence versus reunification, and China attempts to blockade Taiwan, which is one of the options that very many people have spoken about as a potential means of conflict. What if the United States Navy then decides it wants to counter-blockade China and choke it off, both from sources of natural resources and also markets for the goods it produces? Well, the main place that you would have to control if you were to do that sort of counter-blockade is in fact the Strait of Malacca. But guess what? If you don't have Malaysia and Indonesia on side, you ain't going to be able to do that. You're just not, because they primarily are the nations, along with Thailand, that border the Strait of Malacca or have maritime coastline with the Strait of Malacca. So it's of paramount importance to have both of those on side for any such blockade. I would end by saying this with regard to Indonesia. You might not think Indonesia is so important, but don't forget that Indonesia was the nation that the US was afraid might fall to communism as part of the domino effect, cited as a reason for going into Vietnam and fighting the Vietnam War, which ended up to be a disaster. US policymakers have traditionally seen Indonesia as very important. Malaysia is also vitally important. So this stuff should be taken more seriously, and it's not really getting enough coverage in the Western media.
Yeah, so, I mean, I think you alluded to it there. The first point to be made about this is that America's making a series of mistakes here, because these countries in the region are massively invested in the region. Like Malaysia and Indonesia are obviously going to have massively close ties with China. I'm pretty sure that the biggest exporter and importer for both countries now is China. I mean, they're proximate to each other. They produce things, as you said, bauxite and so on, which is wanted by China. As you say, they've done some domestic, in Indonesia, they've done the domestic smelting, but ultimately I'd imagine a lot of that is being sold to China. So the first point is, like, America's vastly overestimating its economic importance for these countries. I think it thinks America, the State Department, is still stuck in kind of 1990s thinking, where American capital and American demand is the big thing in these countries, but it's not. It's now more so Chinese. The second thing I think it highlights is that the US is playing a very dangerous game, because a lot of this kind of decoupling, de-risking, all this stuff is to try and marry foreign politics to trade, obviously, the trade on the economy. Well, what we're seeing from the current situation in Malaysia and Indonesia is that when your foreign policy randomly goes wrong, as it has in the Middle East, well, wrong from the perspective of these countries, when that happens, it doesn't just impact your diplomatic situation. Now, if it impacted just your diplomatic situation, you could wait it out. You could wait out the Gaza war, and you could then go back in and try and rebuild the diplomacy, and that will be fine. But it doesn't just impact that. It impacts trading partner choice and so on. So America has this big plan on the table that it's going to form this trading bloc, which presumably includes Malaysia, and this is going to be self-sufficient, and it's going to, maybe they don't think Malaysia is going to fully block out China, but they think Malaysia is going to be part of their club that's going to wean their dependence off China. Well, what's happening is a random event occurs because you've kind of geopoliticized your trade, and Malaysia turns around and goes, we're going to join the BRICS because we don't like what you're doing in the Middle East. So this is a completely cursed policy from its very inception, trying to entangle foreign affairs, diplomatic relations, and so on with your economy and trade is just bound to result in this complete chaos for the very simple reason that economy and trade are a day-to-day thing that tick over and require kind of long-term structural deals, organizations like the G7 and the BRICS to get together, monetary relationships, membership of international bodies like the IMF and so on, the World Trade Organization. Whereas the hurly-burly of foreign policy and immediate diplomacy has events like October 7th, which are pretty much unpredictable and which upset the apple cart completely. If you marry those two things together, the more volatile component, which is the foreign affairs and diplomatic component, will start interfering with the less volatile component. And also, I'll say, not just the less volatile component, the more important component. So I think this Gaza issue is really highlighting why the American strategy is just completely flawed from the very outset.
The ascent of Musk. This week, the clash of the titans, the European Union versus Elon Musk, flared up again. This battle really started after Elon Musk bought Twitter, which is now known as X, and he fired, if you remember, about 80% of the staff there. And part of that number of staff were the people who did the moderation of Twitter, who banned people, who downvoted people, who blocked people, who, you know, those people, you know how it used to work on Twitter. And they were all booted out unceremoniously. At the same time, the European Union opened up a case against Twitter at the time, or X. It was based on three main issues. First was the EU suspected that Twitter, X, had breached its obligations to counter illegal content and disinformation. They also believed that it breached its transparency obligations. And they believed that Twitter's user interface was deceptively designed. So X and the EU went back and forth on this. At the time, if people remember, Elon Musk alleged that no such similar case has been opened against Facebook or other social media platforms because the EU, again, this is Elon Musk's allegation, the EU offered them all a deal. Basically, you let us step in on the quiet to censor information that we don't like, and we'll not open up these investigations. Musk alleges that the other social media companies, including Facebook, acquiesced to that, agreed to it, and Twitter disagreed with it. And so Twitter finds itself on the end of an EU investigation. Now, this July, that flared up again. Now, this July, that flared up again with the EU saying that it specifically had issue with the blue check marks, which sounds like a really strange thing for a large organization like the EU to be concerned with, the famous Twitter blue checks. What the EU argued was that in the past, these blue checks were for verified individuals. It was prominent people who could be identified as themselves, whereas Elon Musk offered those blue check marks in exchange for a subscription. Now, the EU argued that that prevented consumers from making free and informed decisions. They also had issues with the way that the advertising user interface worked. They believed that Twitter wasn't doing enough to provide information about advertisers on the site, etc., etc. The EU would no doubt argue, Philip, that this is all standard kind of single market stuff that is designed to protect consumers, protect EU rights, protect the workings of the single market. Elon Musk, of course, as we know, would say, well, it's all about the fact that since he's come in, he's changed it so that governments can't put their finger on the scale when it comes to Twitter, which, as we know from the Twitter files, the US government certainly was doing with censoring and generally making sure that some points of view were much more prominent than others. Finally, to get to the crux of the matter, Elon Musk on Monday, we're recording this on Tuesday, so yesterday, Elon Musk interviewed former president and perhaps future president Donald J. Trump on Twitter Live. Now, just before that, the EU sent Elon Musk a letter warning him that the investigation was still ongoing, the case was still open, and implying that interviewing Donald Trump might lead to hate speech and disinformation being disseminated on Twitter, X, which might spill over into the European Union and expose European citizens to this. It's kind of implying that the very fact that he was interviewing Donald Trump might lead to misinformation, disinformation, hateful content that Musk, per EU law, was duty-bound to deal with. This even outraged Elbridge Colby. Elbridge Colby is the principal of a think tank. He worked previously with the last Trump administration. He's, as you know, Philip, usually very urbane, and given his position and all of the debating, quite heated debating he does, usually very calm. But he was actually outraged. He posted like, look, I hear that the EU wants US support, but here they are trying to push a US social media company into censoring Americans when we have a First Amendment, and we view it as one of our most important things. So here's the EU really doing this. And what I find shocking, Philip, is at the same time as the EU is geostrategically hooking itself to the US wagon, at the same time as the EU is really, certainly the bureaucrats, the people who are undertaking this case against X, formerly Twitter, at the same time that they're doing that, and thus reducing their options for trade, reducing their options, their economic options in the world, they really think that they're going to go to war with a US tech giant and there's going to be no consequences to that? It's absolutely insane, Philip. I'm really shocked at the lack of thinking here. But this previously, what I considered a quite petty case of Elon Musk taking issue with the European Union's usual officiousness, seems to have actually taken on a geopolitical aspect.
Well, what it's showing us, finally, for all the world to see, and I don't say this lightly, is that the EU is run by idiots. There's no other way to say it at this stage. You would think that the Commission, the European Commission, which is from the bowels of which this letter emerged, will be working on a strategy for Europe in a massively changing world. Russia's just gone to war with Ukraine. Europe has suffered enormously under the sanctions. America is trying to pull it out of Chinese trade and orbit and so on. And you'd think they'd be working on a strategy. And okay, you might think the strategy is terrible. Like, we criticize the idea that the EU would actually try and decouple from China and form this weird American trade bloc, which would seem, to my mind, to turn them into like an amusement park for Americans or something like that, because there would be no economic rationale for the Union in such a case. But you could still say it's kind of a strategy. It's a terrible strategy, but it's kind of a strategy. But what this is showing is they don't have a serious strategy. These are a bunch of people who consider themselves to be big thinkers and technocrats and stand on the shoulders of the giants that built the EU. Even if you don't like the EU, the people who built the thing were pretty smart and they had strategic vision and so on. These people think they're them, but they're not. What they actually are, ironically, is Twitter addicts. They're Twitter addicts who get head up about things like Elon Musk and Donald Trump, and they have emotive reactions. And they won't say it. They'll dress it up in legalese, like you've seen in this letter. Very legalistic letter, very European Commission, citing each like little violation, each piece of the rule book. But behind all that is a bunch of people having, the typical Trump derangement syndrome. Just emotional people, emotionally incontinent people, actually, who spend most of their time kind of thinking like, if I just ignore that guy in the hallway, it'll show him high school stuff. And there's always some of that in politics. It's fine. Like, that's part of what politics is. But above that is supposed to be some rationality, some strategy. No, it's descended into a Twitter hall of mirrors. And so they just see boogeyman all over here. And you say, like, as Colby did, like, you guys are really intent on keeping this transatlantic relationship that, first of all, Trump doesn't want anymore, and actually most of DC is souring on anyway. Why would you go and attack one of our main social media platforms in public? Why would you go after our companies if you want to maintain this relationship? Well, Mr. Colby, I regret to inform you, they didn't think about it. They're not smart enough to think about that. Or maybe they're smart, but they're incredibly emotionally incontinent people. Clearly, they can't fit their emotional outbursts with their strategy. And increasingly, strategy looks like it's not even there anymore. And all there is emotional outbursts. That's the first point. The second point is, to the extent that there is politics behind this, and, from what I just said, I don't think there's much politics. These people are behaving like the type of people who politicians manipulate, not politicians. But to the extent that there is politics here, it is, I guess, that they're thinking, if we take the side of the Democrats here, who don't like Elon Musk and don't like Donald Trump, then we'll win or something. Because I guess Trump is going to shut down the whole transatlantic relationship anyway. So if we can snipe from over here at Elon Musk and Donald Trump in a way that the Democrats can't because of the First Amendment, because of free speech laws and so on, if we can snipe at them from over here, we'll please that side and they'll maintain the relationship that they have with us here. Well, two things about that. First, it's pathetic. It's pathetic. Like, as a European, I find that absolutely pathetic that that's where our leadership is right now, that they want to like hang on the coattails, doing the dirty work of one political party in the United States to maintain some like money and defense flows or whatever. Second of all, it's not going to work. I mean, come on. You're basing your strategy, a strategic partnership, on choosing one side in a highly polarized country. Imagine if China or Russia did that. Imagine if they chose one side in a highly polarized country and said, that's our strategy. We'd all be looking at newspapers saying these people are unserious, they don't know how to do strategy properly, their diplomacy's shot. But we look at this and we go, it's normal, I guess. I mean, the other thing I'd say is the irony is that, look, the low caliber that we see among European politicians has many, many components to it. There's no doubt about that. But one of them probably is obsessive Twitter use. The really funny thing about this is that the dragon that these guys are trying to slay, because they're overly emotional, can't strategize, can't do politics properly, just incompetent. A great deal of that incompetence comes from the fact that they're addicted to the very thing that the dragon represents. They're addicted to the Twitter machine. And they're addicted to looking at scary posts of Donald Trump and all this kind of thing. So, I mean, if Twitter was a psychological warfare operation set up by the United States to destroy Europe, I mean, it's done the job. It really has. And now that they're going and completely burning their credibility in DC and annoying probably the incoming president of the United States to slay the very dragon that drove them crazy, I mean, the irony of it's just too beautiful.
3 quick points to that. The first is, I really struggle to see this being dropped. Anybody who knows the way the EU works is that once the bureaucracy gets its teeth into something, it simply keeps squeezing until it's crushed the bones of it. That's how the European Union works. Once it's opened this case, once it's found against Twitter X. It's just going to keep squeezing, and that's the end of it. The second thing I would say is that this is going to add to a series of very long-standing EU-US disputes on trade and economics and businesses and practices. Perhaps the most prominent one of that is Boeing versus Airbus. Also involved is the agricultural sector. Also involved is cars. I mean, there are a whole long list. Traditionally, the reason for that is that both the US and EU never really negotiated trade treaties. They always just offered terms, essentially. You either accepted them or you didn't. Both of them were so powerful that that's what you do. You don't negotiate with the EU. Varis Varoufakis, the former Greek finance minister who we've mentioned a few times on this show, basically explained this. The EU doesn't negotiate. It just offers terms. The problem is that the US is exactly the same. So, of course, they both go into negotiations offering terms to each other, and neither of them can agree. So this will be added to that. The problem that the EU face, as you quite rightly say, Philip Pilkington, is that the EU is increasingly moving into a much weaker position. It's increasingly moving into a subordinated position. And that process has accelerated dramatically over the last 2 years, as you and I have detailed extensively on this podcast. The final thing I'll say in this is, doesn't this say something about the way that the European Union and European nations in general missed the internet revolution, missed the digitization revolution in industry and markets? There is no European Microsoft, there's no European Apple, there's no European Facebook, there's no European Google, there's no European X, there's no European Uber even, there's no European Amazon even. It's all American. They're entirely reliant on the Americans for this stuff. And what they're attempting to do is regulate it and capture it and run it in the way that they want. And I'm not sure that's going to work in a situation where geostrategically they're increasingly reliant on the US. And what we might see in the coming years and decades is finally the US winning some of these long-standing battles with the European Union on regulation and the rest of it.